Okay.
All right, so the recording has started. So, hello, housing providers and Region of Waterloo staff who are tuning in. And I wanted to welcome you to our second installment of Community Table Talk. My name is Danielle Phillips. I am the Tenancy Liaison Specialist, and the topic for our segment today will be conflict between tenants. So I would first like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I host from today is the land traditionally used by the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral people. I also acknowledge the enduring presence and deep traditional knowledge and philosophies of the Indigenous people of whom we share this land today. So my guest today is Jason Spencer, who is the Program Coordinator of Community Mediation Services with Community Justice Initiatives, or CJI. So welcome, Jason, and thank you for joining me.
Good morning, Danielle. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I imagine some of our housing providers likely already know who you are.
I'm sure they do, but it's always good to revisit these conversations. Yeah,
Absolutely. All right, so let's just jump right in. Let's start with exploring some of the reasons why tenants may find themselves in conflict with one another.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different reasons, but I think I'll just touch on a few that sort of stand out to me just as overarching themes. And so, first I would say is that there's a lack of relationship, right? In particular when maybe a new neighbor moves in, or even when you've been in a community for a while, that when you don't have a good rapport with other people, then that can be a place where it's easier to get into conflict than with someone. Not that you can't get in conflict with someone you know well, it's easier to get out of it when you have some relationship. So even small things like getting to know your neighbor's name, being friendly in terms of brief interactions that you might have in the hallway or in common space can be really helpful, just in terms of putting a name to the face. And that helps in terms of when you might have conflict, you have to deal with someone, you can go over and say, if I come up to you, I can say, hey, Danielle, can we talk, right? And that's much different than, hey, you, can we talk? So I think, getting to know your neighbors a little bit can be helpful in terms of reducing conflict. I think there's also, go ahead.
Just a quick question. Is there the assumption that all neighbors have some sort of relationship then?
I think that I was going to mention this. I think there's a level of obligation that comes with being a neighbor. And do you have some relationship with them? Yeah, and while you share space, right? And so that comes with an inherent obligation of what does that mean to share space with each other, and then how do we define that together? Right. And so I think, as a housing provider, there's a responsibility to that. As a tenant, there's also a responsibility to that. But, a large amount of times we don't have those conversations until such point that we're actually in conflict with each other. And then it gets more difficult to navigate those because, we already have our baseline of expectation and our expectations aren't being met.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And related to that, I think it's really important to talk about how we're going to resolve conflict with each other, not if we're going to have conflict, but when we're going to have conflict, because living in community, is inherently has conflict in it, which is all right. It really just comes down to how do we navigate that. And I think there's things that as a housing provider you can do in terms of setting some expectations when people move in. But also maybe, helping people to think about what is their role in responding to concerns that they might have with a neighbor. And, I find that in general, people tend to outsource the responsibility for dealing with conflict to other people instead of taking responsibility for it themselves. And so what does that look like? Well, that might be my neighbor's making a lot of noise. Well, do I talk to my neighbor? Do I let them know how their noise is impacting me? Or do I tell the service provider? Or do I call bylaw? Or even in more extreme cases, do I bring in the police? The moment that I take away the relationship, then that further creates a gap between me and that other person where then they're like, well, why is my housing provider now calling me and telling me to keep the noise down, or bylaw or police showing up at my door, right? This naturally impacts the relationship. And even if you're not the person to call bylaw, if you're the person that this person has been having perhaps conflictual experiences with, you become the target of, you become the person who's calling bylaw, which just sort of further entrenches people's perspectives of each other. And really where we hope to get is that, what does it mean to be neighborly with each other and having that conversation? Yeah, so I think helping people to understand, knowing that there's other resources, maybe some expectation of, if you have a problem with your neighbor, our first hope would be that you would talk to your neighbor about that before taking other routes. And not everybody feels comfortable with that, and so how do you support those individuals so that they can maybe still express their voice in a positive way, or feel that they can approach someone? Because that place of even feeling comfortable about approaching another person does come with it some requirement to feel empowered in that situation. And if you don't, then needing to look at how you support people to do that on their own. But yeah, even just setting that expectation, and then you can go to that person when they do reach out to housing. Well, how did you approach this conflict with that person? Right. So let me hear how you've tried to solve it before I try to step in and maybe be a resource in solving this problem for you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it sounds like encouraging tenants to have that initial conversation in a safe, respectful way would be the first step prior to housing providers getting involved in any kind of conflict between tenants.
Indeed, yeah. Yeah, and that's where that relational piece comes in, because if I know your name, it may feel more comfortable for me to approach you than if I don't know your name.
Yeah, absolutely. So at what point should housing providers step in then? When should they become involved in those conflicts?
Well, I think, again, right at the beginning of the tenancy is a great place to sort of get involved, setting those expectations and checking with people about their capacity to sort of address those issues. I think the other place to get involved is when it does reach a place of escalation, that this isn't just between the two tenants who are having conflict. It probably is a wider issue in that either other people are being impacted by the conflict, right? Because there might be raised voices, might be other behaviors that are problematic that are affecting other neighbors, as well as usually neighbors will seek other people to support their perspective on that, right? And so then you end up with perhaps various cliques of neighbors who all talk poorly about each other in one way or another, which only further entrenches that, right? Gossip is quite toxic in a community setting, and so if you can find ways to minimize that, that's important. And to recognize by stepping in, it's not necessarily about taking those people's power away or saying you have to do it this way, but recognizing that the longer it goes unaddressed, the more problematic it can become, not only for the two people at the center of it, but also for the larger community. And so how you approach those conflicts in that moment is very important, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So something kind of a curveball I'd like to throw you is one example of potentially that toxic relationship affecting the community is sometimes we see community members signing a petition to have one neighbor removed, or to have some sort of punitive action taken against that one neighbor. So if a housing provider is noticing those behaviors, how could they empower the group to maybe address their needs in a different way?
Mm-hmm. Well, in terms of my services, one of the things that we do is circles for communities. And so in that, inviting the community to come together to have a conversation about what needs might be unaddressed in this situation. So not about targeting that one individual and talking about, how they're a problem neighbor, but talking about, what maybe as a community they might need in order to be successful. And so in a circle, we make use of a talking piece, so that empowers each person involved to speak to the guiding question or to pass. And really we work towards, sort of a present future focus of what the community would like to see differently. I think if you're getting to the place of petitions being signed, right, that speaks to that proactiveness of addressing issues before they get to that place, because you probably heard more about this situation before the petition came, and now it's just, people are, again, that clique experience of they've all ganged up on this one person, and I've seen it be quite harmful for everybody involved. I remember a situation very similar to that, and it's not that the person's behaviors weren't in question, but that person had a lot going on in their personal life, and then just felt targeted not only by their neighbors but by the property management organization, because they had kept hearing all the complaints basically aligned with the tenants who were complaining, and so it felt very imbalanced there. And and it's not to say that neighbor whose behaviors were problematic didn't need to change their behaviors, but that response needed to happen well before a petition was being signed to have them evicted.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I think that also kind of leads into the question of, how do housing providers support tenants that are in conflict without seeming to favor one or the other?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize the role of triangulation in relationship. And so, as a housing provider, right, you might get one or both of the tenants coming to you and saying, "Hey, I've got a problem with this neighbor," right? That story is going to be very compelling because partly, the tenant in question wants to be heard, acknowledged. They want something done, right? These are all valid expressions of concern. And what you do in that moment of hearing both one party, so if you hear one party, then you should perhaps give space to the other party to hear what's going on for them too, so that they both feel like they're having equal time with the property management or whoever that might be, so it doesn't feel imbalanced. Recognizing the power that is inherent to being in a role of property manager, right? You have someone's housing in your hands, right? And so the decisions you make, how you address those situations, go a long way to addressing the concerns. And when people feel that maybe they're not being taken seriously, or that the other neighbor is being favored, right? What does that say to them? Well, that perhaps my housing is at risk, right? And so as such, you may see escalated behavior from that person, because now they're going to a place where they might be having a fear-based response because their basic need, housing, is perhaps being threatened. Talking about how both parties can be part of the solution. Right, so it's not about you as the housing provider coming in and saying you're good and you're bad, right? Maybe in some situations that makes sense, right? And there's definitely a role for that, right, if it's ongoing. But to begin with is, what are the two of you going to do differently in the future to minimize this problem? And maybe there's a place where a community resource such as community justice initiatives, mediation services could be of use in a situation like that. And I think helping people to think about what it means to keep people in housing, right? That is a human right for all of us to have housing. And so how can they do that in a way that minimizes their impact on other people, or again creates place for communication, so that they're being the ones to be the solution makers in this? Because in the end of the day, they continue to have to live beside each other, but you as the property manager may get to go home to do other things.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to recognize right now, in the current times that we have in 2020 and 2021, there has been a moratorium on evictions. So behaviors that may result in an eviction are not at this point. So there's been a lot of trust broken between neighbors who feel like the household that, isn't behaving appropriately, isn't being consequenced. Housing providers are extremely frustrated with landlord-tenant board because no movement is happening on a lot of cases there. I think at this point, it's important to recognize that everyone is under a lot of pressure. Housing providers feel it directly, but tenants feel it directly too right now.
Yeah, definitely. And I think in that, right, there's, the impact of on our mental health of the pandemic too. And so third party supports could be something like Here 24/7 or other community resources to help support that person who may not be doing very well in the situation. And as such, their behaviors are reflective of that, the challenging time that we're in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I do want to do a little plug for one of the previous events that we had held, the Virtual Community Resources Fair. There was a sheet of contact information for a variety of different organizations. I would encourage landlords, property managers, and any Region of Waterloo staff who are watching this to just go back and take a look, because I think the more support we can put in place, even if something does end up in eviction, if we can put preventative measures in right now, it will be immensely helpful for the remainder of their tenancy and the success of future tenancies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about encouraging tenants to address conflict on their own, the role of a housing provider in terms of navigating those conflicts with tenants. When should police or emergency services or the justice system become involved in those conflicts?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a role for police that's in some situations, but I think that is if there's a concern for your personal safety or the safety of another person, right? That would be an ideal time for the police to be involved, even to do a safety check on someone, or when there's clear illegal activities going on, right? Even if it's unclear, but you may be concerned of illegal activities, that maybe calling the regular police line instead of 911 just to check in and explore with them whether or not this is a concern that should be addressed, and also thinking about going back to what I originally said, have I addressed this with my neighbor, right? In terms of maybe setting some clear boundaries around my expectations, or making a request for, that behavior to be done elsewhere, right? Even small things like, like smoking cannabis, cigarettes, things like that, right? Sometimes police are brought into this when it's not a legal issue anymore. However, it still might be impacting your health negatively, right? In terms of the smoke or the smell, right? And that request of your neighbor to maybe take their habit somewhere else is not necessarily unrealistic. It's how you present that versus what you're asking that may be the more challenging piece for them to hear. But if you're asking the police to show up at their door, then just recognize if there's not a safety concern or not an illegal activity, that how are you making use of police resources, as well as the impact on your relationship with your neighbor when police do show up at their door. That in my experience talking to neighbors does not lend to a favorable relationship.
Yeah. So two things that you said that I'm hoping you can expand on a bit. One is that you had mentioned a safety or wellness check from police. I'm hoping you can just elaborate a bit more on what that looks like or what that entails. And the second one is, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. Could you potentially give some more information on the most effective way for tenants to communicate with one another?
I will do my best. So in answer to the safety check, my experience is that if you call the police and you say, I am worried about my neighbor, I haven't seen them, or they're acting in very unsafe ways, that what they will do is send out a couple of officers to do a wellness check on that individual. Really, they're just making sure that that person is safe, that they're not going to harm themselves or another person, and then they will go on their way. They may bring in a mental health professional along the way if they felt that that was important to the situation, but generally it's just a check-in. So it's not them looking to press charges on someone, but really to make sure that that person is physically, mentally safe at that time. To the second question, how do you say something? Well, that's I think it's about checking in with yourself first and just making sure what is the problem that I want to address, and clearly differentiating between the person and the problem, right? So it's not, Danielle, you're a problem, but Danielle, when you're making a lot of noise and I'm trying to sleep, that is a problem. And so that can be more helpful for the person to hear. What you're trying to do is get them less defensive. And so even when you're thinking of approaching them, right, just even to check in with them as you're doing that, I have a problem that I need to talk to you about. Do you have a few minutes that I could ask you about that, instead of just diving into the problem? It gives the person a chance to say yes or no to that. If they say no, then you want to follow up is, when can we speak about the problem, right? Because you don't want to let it go unaddressed, but you also want to give people the opportunity to say yes or no to the request for a conversation. In that conversation, just be clear about, what are you asking for? So I might say, when you're playing music, after 10 p.m., right? I'm trying to sleep at that point in time. Is there another time you can play your music, or can you listen to your music in a different way? What are some options that you could think of, right? So, it's good to have some solutions yourself, but it's also helpful to invite solutions from the other party. That invites them into the thinking part of their brain, and also you might learn information about their needs that you weren't aware of as you try to meet both of your needs, right? Because it's about trying to meet everybody's needs on some level in this conversation, and seeing what options are. You want to make sure that you're calm when you go, right? So in the moment that it's happening may not be the best time. Take 5 minutes and take a few deep breaths, check in with yourself. And then when you feel more calm, maybe go and approach the conversation versus going with a full head of steam into the conversation. Because, it's your body language, your tone of voice, as much as the words you use that help to help the other person to hear you differently. Yeah.
So what if the tenant says, I have a problem with my neighbor, so I ran upstairs and I dropped a letter in their mailbox?
Mm-hmm.
Would that be a method of communication you would see as helpful? What's the thought around that?
Yeah, well, it could be a tool for communication. My preference in communication is face-to-face, phone, something written like a letter or email. The last option would be text. I find that text does not work well because emotions aren't communicated. Face-to-face is good because you get to hear and see what the person's responding like, as well as they get to see you. As well, if it's just, what is the content of the letter? If it's, you need to turn down your noise, that's not inviting people to a conversation. That's telling them what to do. And people are resistant to being told what to do. That's why property managers, bylaw, police showing up at people's doors tends to be less effective unless they're quite amicable to being told what to do, which I would say
Very few of us are.
Very few of us are, yeah. Once you become a teenager, you become resistant to being told what to do. And that extends throughout the rest of your life.
I would agree.
Yeah. And so recognizing that, right? How would you respond to a letter being put in your mailbox telling you what to do? Probably not well, right? This is a place of defining things together, right? And that place of building your obligations to one another with one another is really important to it being effectively resolved. It can't be one way and not the other way.
Yeah. So all of this, I know for some of our housing providers, this is not something that it was traditionally kind of taught in property management. It was more the legal side of things and the paperwork side of things. And I think the expectations of property managers has kind of evolved over time, especially for those who have been doing this for a couple of decades.
Mhm.
So if housing providers aren't necessarily comfortable with helping tenants navigate that situations on their own, or if they're just looking for some extra support, what are some community resources that they could reach out to?
Mhm. Well, definitely our service at Community Justice Initiatives or Community Mediation Services is specifically designed to address these situations. It's available to anyone in the community, so they can just call me or email me directly. And we have a couple of options there. So one might be some conflict coaching, which is one-on-one work with an individual to maybe help them think through their responses to conflict and how they might approach conflict differently. The second piece is the mediation itself, and that looks at bringing people together to have a different conversation around how they can live beside each other, what both of the parties need in order to address the concerns, and then working on an agreement around that. All of our services are voluntary, so that's a really important component
Mm.
where, in particular, in a neighbor conflict that maybe not everybody wants to be involved. You know, you can encourage people in that direction, but in the end, any decisions they make are their decisions. It's also a confidential process, and so we invite that opportunity for conversation in mediation, with the recognition that only what the parties agree upon will be shared with others. But that's also a really important piece of the conversation, because again, it's not just the neighbors who are impacted. It could be other neighbors. It could be the housing manager, for example. All of these groups might need some sort of feedback from what's happened from this conversation, and then just our role is to empower people to make decisions around that. So we're not there to advocate, give advice, or make decisions on behalf of the parties, but really help them to say what they need to say, hear what they need to hear, and make some decisions together.
Mhm. So, what
uh,
circumstances in a mediation would a property manager or representative from housing attend?
yeah well, as long as both parties were in agreement, there may be some benefit to the property manager being in attendance. One, in terms of being on the same page about what is going on,
Mm.
right? So in similar circumstances, we have brought in the service provider to be sort of just a silent partner within the conversation. So not there to say yes or no, but maybe to either provide information. For example, what are the expectations of living in this residence, right?
Mhm.
If that's not clear, also, it may be informative for them so that they actually hear from both parties at the same time what's going on, and as they build understanding with each other. So there definitely can be in place as long as the neighbors are in agreement for the property manager to be there. I can see there's some benefits to that. I think it's about checking in as to what are the hopes of the property manager being there, right? If it's about them being a decision maker, like I would maybe ask them to rethink about that, because again, really want to empower the people involved in the conflict to be the solution makers to resolve the conflict.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So, I see we're coming up on our half an hour. Is there anything else that you'd like to bring up or discuss before we wrap up?
Um, yeah, like I think just one of the pieces you mentioned around sort of like how things have changed, right? I think what I hear locally anyways, is that hope to keep people housed, right? And that we may be trying to house more challenging people with more challenging situations, right? Um, and so what does that look like, and how could it be different, right? There's this place where we have policies and procedures, which are important in terms of making sure, we have some clarity around expectations, but there's also a relational piece. And sometimes, what can be helpful is to make use of the policies and procedures to promote relationship. By that, I mean, when people are avoidant of conflict, which we all can be avoidant, is that sometimes, a well-timed eviction letter can get someone's attention, not for the purposes of evicting them, but purposes of bringing them to the table for conversation. And so how do you sort of manage that relational piece of getting to know people, helping them to feel supported, and also applying sort of the tools that are in your toolbox to maybe make that happen. Because I think that's the most challenging thing, is when there are all these community resources, when people do want to come to the table, and yet you have that one person who may be avoidant. And then, that opens up a different conversation of what might they need in order to be successful. And so in that, you might learn about, the other challenges that they're facing that perhaps are a barrier to some of these resources, and then, meet their needs so that they can then go and do these other pieces as well. So I think, that, especially, given the moratorium on evictions, that we need to think creatively about how do we get people to have conversations, because that's going to serve everybody in the long run, is my opinion, that the more we can communicate with each other, build relationships, resolve conflict successfully with each other, that these are all really practical components to having a healthy community.
Absolutely. Absolutely, I agree.
Beyond that, I don't know, will you be sharing my CGI's contact information in this video, or how does that happen?
I can send it out with the link to this video, or you can state it now and make sure that we have that resource available for everyone.
All right, well, you can always contact us at CGI at 519-744-6549, or my direct email is jasons@cjiwr.com.
Perfect. Jason, you'd figure I'd have that memorized by now, how frequently I call you, but maybe next time.
Yeah, that's all right. I don't remember anybody's phone numbers anymore, Danielle.
Age of technology.
That's right.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jason, for taking the time, sitting down and having this conversation. Hopefully folks found it helpful. And, I'm sure that now that you've shared your information, hopefully people will be able to learn a bit more if they're interested.
Most definitely. Thanks for the opportunity, Danielle.
Wonderful. Thank you.